We've visited Christmas, but now we're going to come back to Thanksgiving. So I'd like you to look at Psalm 100. We'll read that together. Psalm 100, verses 1 through 5. So if you just follow as I read, starting at verse 1, Psalm 100. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. Know that the Lord, he is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name. For the Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations. So who is the most influential person in your life today? You might think somebody in your past. That's not really what I'm talking about. Maybe somebody who you would say has made you who you are today. But that's not really what I'm focused on. I'm thinking about your everyday life. Every day, who has the most influence in your life? And we might think a spouse or a parent or somebody that we admire or respect. But if you're like most of us, you would probably have to say the most influential person in your life is you. Some of you, I can see you're thinking, I should say Jesus. And you're right, you should. But that's more of a Sunday school answer, right? The most influential person for most of us is us. We talk to ourselves more than anybody else talks to us, even if you live with a talker. We listen to ourselves. We believe almost everything we tell ourselves. We almost never tell ourselves to be quiet or interrupt ourselves. We always listen to what we have to say to ourselves. And because of that, we tend to be the most influential person in our lives. Jesus explained to us in Matthew chapter 12 that everything we say and everything we do comes out of what is in our hearts. And I know we've talked about this a little bit before, that if you boil the heart down to its most basic level, I think we can say that our heart is what we believe and what we want, our beliefs and our desires. So if we want to change our hearts, that's what we evaluate, and that's what we change, what we believe and what we want out of life, or what we want in our lives. So the question is, when we talk to ourselves, are we telling ourselves the truth? And most of us assume that we are. We assume that our heart is in the right place, even though we know that Jeremiah 17:9 is in the Bible, and many of us have earned a lot of points and a lot of prizes quoting that verse over and over again, that the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. Still, in spite of that, we generally tend to believe what we tell ourselves. We tend to assume our heart is in the right place. I want to approach Psalm 100 from that perspective this morning. Most of the Psalms are biblical poetry, and we as Americans, we tend to think of poetry as things like roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. That's a poem for most Americans. We expect to see words that rhyme. We expect to hear kind of a rhythm as we quote poetry. But Hebrew poetry, of course, doesn't work that way, especially after it's been translated into English. You don't see words that rhyme. You really don't hear much of a rhythm. But a lot of times in biblical poetry, you'll have maybe 2 stanzas or maybe more than that. And most often, the first stanza will sort of give the concept, and then the second stanza will either repeat the first stanza or maybe add some information to it, or sometimes contrast what the first stanza said. That's how most Hebrew poetry is laid out. And I think we see that here in Psalm 100. At least the way I interpret it, I would say the first 3 verses form the first stanza. And he gives us some instructions for worship in verses 1 and 2, and then he talks about our beliefs in verse 3 that form worship. And then I think in verses 4 and 5, you have the second stanza, which sort of repeats and adds some information to the first. In verse 4, again, you have some instruction for worship, and then in verse 5, some of the beliefs in our heart that lead to worship, that influence our worship. That's kind of how I see Psalm 100. So as we go through this morning, if I could boil my whole message down to one sentence, this would be the sentence: that true worship that pleases God is based on belief that comes from God. True worship that pleases God is based on belief that comes from God. Not just things we've made up or heard from other people, but belief that comes from definitive, definite statements that God has revealed to us in His Word. That's what forms worship that pleases Him. So looking this morning at Psalm 100, there are two concepts, really repeated, that I think will impact our worship. And the first concept is this, that our worship is based on our beliefs. In verses 1 and 2, we have some instruction for worship. The writer says in verse 1, "Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into His presence with singing." There were three instructions there. First, he said, make a joyful noise. And this is a verse that has been used to comfort people like me who cannot sing, right? You can at least make a joyful noise. And I do. Sometimes it's joyful. It's almost always some kind of noise. I'm one of the guys, and when I say I can't sing, I mean it. I'm not just trying to be falsely modest. I have no idea. And I have one note and one tune that I use no matter what the song is, which sounds kind of bad, but if you stop and think about it, it means that I can sing just about any song that's ever been written, plus a few that haven't. We do tend to visit churches a lot, and every once in a while, Bonnie will lean over to me and say, "Do you know this song?" And I say no, but it doesn't matter. I can sing it like I do every other song. But that's not really what the psalmist was talking about here. He's not talking about just a random noise that you produce. The joyful noise is actually a glad shout. It is a coordinated, definite, specific statement about the goodness or the greatness of God. Make a joyful noise. Make a glad shout. A definite declaration about something that God has done or something about who He is. And then he went on to say in verse 1, serve the Lord with gladness. And we know that part of worship is serving God. It's not just the songs we sing or the things we think about or what we say, but worship also involves what we do. And part of worship is serving God by serving His people and other people. Serve the Lord with gladness. And we do that not to gain favor with God or to somehow earn His pleasure, but we do it as a response out of a grateful heart for what God has done and who God is in our lives. Serve the Lord with gladness. And then he went on in verse 2 to say, come into His presence with singing. And this is, again, an act of a body of people who have come specifically to worship God through an expression of worship. And that is our purpose in coming together. It's not an emotional response. It's not to produce emotion in us. The singing before the Lord is not just to prepare us for the preaching, but it is all part of pleasing and honoring God. But I want to go back to a phrase that I sort of skipped over in verse 1. He said, make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Who is it that is to make the joyful noise? If we just answer that question without really looking at what he said, most of us would assume he's talking to the people of God. The people of God should make a joyful noise to the Lord, the nation of Israel, or the church. And certainly we should, but that's not what he said here in verse 1. He said, all the earth make a joyful noise to the Lord. And so I think what he's saying here applies to the church and applies to the people of God, but that's not really his focus. I think he's talking about a time still in the future when all the earth will make a joyful noise to the Lord and serve the Lord with gladness and come into His presence with singing. When Christ establishes His kingdom, when he has defeated every single enemy of his, and he is now the king, and everyone is under his authority, then all the earth will make a joyful noise to the Lord. This is a great day coming when worship will affect the entire earth. The entire population of the earth will honor him. And in the meantime, we are spreading the gospel, we are discipling people, we are developing under God's control this audience of people, this group of people who will make a noise, a joyful noise to the Lord. These instructions for worship are based on beliefs. And I think he explains that in verse 3. He began in verse 3 by saying, knowing that the Lord, he is God. When we come to God in worship, we are coming before the only living and true God, the God who is infinite, the God who is absolutely perfect, the God who is self-existent, who is self-sufficient, the God who needs nothing from us. That's who we're coming to worship, the Lord God, the eternal Spirit, who is not like us, but is far above us, as far as the heavens are from the earth. That's who we're coming to worship. He went on to say in verse 3, it is he who made us, and we are his. As we come to God in worship, we are coming to our Creator, the one who has formed us, the one who has formed our soul, our heart, our mind. We're coming to the God who is our Creator, who is our absolute authority in every sense of the word. He went on to say in verse 3, we are his people and the sheep of his pasture. And because God is our Creator, we belong to him. We are his. We are not free. We are not independent spirits to do as we please and expect people to serve us. We belong to him. We don't have absolute freedom. Even Satan, who was created by God, does not have absolute freedom. He is never outside of the authority of God. God is always our Lord. He is always our master. Whether we accept it or not, acknowledge it or not, does not change God's position over us. He is our absolute authority. The psalmist began verse 3 by saying, know that the Lord is God. And that's not a fourth instruction there. It is the reason, it is the basis of our worship. He could have said, knowing that the Lord, he is God. You make a joyful noise, you come into his presence with singing, you serve the Lord with gladness, because we know that the Lord, he is God. That we are his people, we are the sheep of his pasture. Our knowledge, what we believe in our heart, forms the basis of our worship. It informs our worship. We worship because of the beliefs that are in our heart, that come from God. This knowledge that God is Creator, we belong to him, forms the foundation of our worship. It's not the songs we sing, it's not the style that we follow, but it is our understanding, our belief in who God is that controls the way that we worship. So I just want to encourage you, because I know you're still celebrating Thanksgiving. I know that. So as you come and you celebrate Thanksgiving, or tomorrow morning when you get up early to spend time with God, stop and remind yourself that I am coming before my Lord, who is absolutely in authority over me. I am coming before my Creator, and I am coming as one of his sheep, one of his people. That's who I am worshiping today. Focus on the greatness of God. Before you start focusing on the problems and the things you want God to do, stop and think about the greatness of God. Meditate on who he is as your Creator, as the one who is in control, who always accomplishes his purpose. You see, this belief, this worship comes directly from our belief, and our belief is centered in our hearts, our way of thinking. Before I go on in Psalm 100, I want to stop and look at another passage that helps us understand how our beliefs can change our worship, how that happens. Psalm 100 gives us the what, but I want to look at a passage that shows us how. If you'll look with me at Jeremiah chapter 17 and verses 5 through 10. And I mentioned verse 9 already. That's the one that we've memorized, but it's in a context I think that is important. So let's read verses 5 through 10. Jeremiah 17. Jeremiah says, "Cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord. He is like a shrub in the desert and shall not see any good come. He shall dwell in the parched places of the wilderness, in an uninhabited salt land. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes. For its leaves remain green and is not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind, to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds." Looking at these 5 verses, I see 4 pictures in here that help us understand how our heart affects our worship. The first picture I'm going to look at is at the end of the passage, verses 9 and 10, where Jeremiah talks about the heart. And in verses 9 and 10, he gives us 4 realities about the heart. First, he said in verse 9 that the heart is deceitful above all things. Deceitful above all things. And when he said our heart is deceitful, he's not just saying that our hearts lie to us or give us bad information. He's saying that our heart is actually corrupt. It is polluted. There is no potential for truthfulness there. It is absolutely corrupt. It is crooked. It is polluted. He went on to say, number 2, in verse 9, that our heart is desperately sick. And desperately sick means it is incurable. It cannot be corrected or reformed. The heart is weak. It is slippery. It is incurable. There is no ability for our heart to be healthy again. And then the third thing, he said, who can understand it? We don't even know how deceitful and sick our hearts really are. We can't even understand that. Most of us, as I said before, generally assume that our heart is in the right place. We generally, naturally trust our heart, even though Jeremiah says we cannot, because we don't understand. Do you ever look in the mirror and say to yourself, who are you? How could you do this again? We don't even understand how all that works. And then the fourth thing he said in verse 10, which is the good news, God does understand our hearts. He does know what's going on. And we can trust him to do this, to reveal to us areas that need to change, where we need to grow, where we need to be refocused on truth. So there's no correcting our heart. There's no reshaping or redirecting our hearts. We need new hearts. That's the only solution, and we receive new hearts in Jesus Christ. That's the influence of the heart, the first picture. Now would you come back up to verses 5 and 6, where we look at the second picture, and that is this shrub in the desert. Jeremiah is writing the words in verses 5 and 6, but they come directly from God himself. And he starts out by saying, "Cursed is the man who trusts in man." The word curse there, it means empty or bitter. So I don't think God is saying, I'm going to curse you if you trust in man. I don't think this is a threat. I think it's a simple statement of fact, that trusting in man leads to an empty, bitter life. The word trust there in verse 5 is a word that means to rely on, to depend on. These are God's people that he is speaking to. So if you were to go around and ask them, do you believe in God? Do you trust God? Probably most of them would say, well, of course, yes, I do. They're trusting God, they like his promises, they believe in him, but they're really relying on or depending on themselves or other people to get them through, to solve their problem. I think that's what he's talking about here. The person who, yes, I believe in God, I follow him, but I'm really relying on myself, or I'm relying on other people around me to get me through, to solve my problems. He said he makes flesh his strength. And the word strength there is also translated arm or shoulder, right? That's where you carry a heavy load when you've got to get something moved. It's what you're relying on, what you're depending on. The promises of God are nice, but I'm really relying on myself or other people. And the result of that is explained in verse 6. He's like a shrub in the desert, shall not see any good come. He shall dwell in the parched places of the wilderness, in an uninhabited salt land. I don't know of any better picture of an empty, bitter life than that. How do shrubs get out in the desert? Nobody goes out there and plants them, right? The seeds just kind of get carried along in the wind and germinate. Nobody intentionally puts shrubs in the desert. And none of us plan to be like a shrub in the desert. None of us have set that as a goal in our lives. But it happens. How does it happen? It happens by establishing this pattern, this habit of depending on myself, or depending on other people around me, or depending on my circumstances for joy, peace, and happiness. It leads to the opposite. That's the second picture. The third picture is in verses 7 and 8, the tree planted by a river. How does a person get to be a tree planted by the river? This tree is intentionally planted right there. It is the result of an intentional decision that was made. And he explains the decision. He says it twice. He has established this pattern, this habit of trusting in the Lord instead of trusting in people. And the result is explained in verse 8, this tree by the river that's producing fruit. There's a fourth picture here that is not quite as specific, but I think it's clearly here, and that is the heat or the sun. The heat is often used in Scripture as an illustration of trial or difficulty. And the heat is coming down on both trees. It was mentioned with the tree by the river, but we also know it's in the desert, right? How does the sun affect the shrub that's in the desert? The sun makes a miserable life even more miserable. And I think we could say that's how trials affect us when we're living like that, right? They just keep adding on. I get up late in the morning, I'm late for work, I get in the car, I have a flat tire. I get that fixed, and then my transmission goes out. And with each one, it's like, this is the last thing I needed. Now there's one more problem to solve. And we just keep getting lower and lower and more burdened down. And when is this going to quit? When is God going to recognize I've gone beyond my limit? How can I keep going like this? That's how the sun affects the shrub in the desert. And I can say it like that because I've been there too. How does the sun affect the tree that's planted by the river? Both trees have to endure the same sun. They go through the same kinds of experiences. But the tree by the river is helped by the sun, right? He needs the sun to produce fruit, to be a healthy tree. And I believe in the same way, a person who's living with genuine, sincere trust in God recognizes the value of trial. They're not any easier, but he recognizes that God is using this as a tool to shape me, to help me grow, to help me become stronger in my walk with him. When our heart is governed by a genuine sense of trust in God, it doesn't make the trials any easier to endure, but we don't spend our time living in fear of those trials either, or trying to avoid them. Instead, we recognize that God is using this as a tool that I need in my life. I like to use this passage when I'm counseling a lot because I think it helps us to recognize where our hearts are and how important our hearts are to the way that we're responding to our problems, to our difficulties. But I notice a lot of times as we're going through this passage with someone that a lot of times I get sort of a blank stare in response. And finally, a lot of people will say to me, well, I know that. I do believe in God. I do trust God. That's not my problem. My problem is that my husband is an idiot. So if you'd help me with that, maybe I'd be okay. So then I'll start asking, which of these two trees would you say is a picture of your life today? And most people will tell me, my life is like a shrub in the desert today. That's why they're there for counseling. Then my next question is, what makes you say that? What makes you believe that your life is like this shrub in the desert? And most people will kind of point back to the sun, to the trial. Okay, that's why my life is like a shrub in the desert. I am depressed because my son is in jail. My son is not in jail. He wants me to make sure you know that, but it's just an illustration. I am fearful because I was just diagnosed with heart disease. I am anxious because I just lost my job. In each of those statements, we're taking our trial, my son being in jail, heart disease, losing my job, and drawing a direct line to the way I feel. I'm depressed. I am anxious. I'm fearful. That's a natural thing to do, but when we do that, we are trusting in our circumstances. We're trusting in and focusing on what people are doing, what people are saying. I'm relying on my son staying out of jail to be happy. I'm relying on good health. I'm relying on a job that I can trust in and be secure. These are the things that I'm depending on for peace and safety and strength in my life. That's why my life is like a shrub in the desert. It's not because of these trials, it's because of my response. It's because of what is going on in my heart. I followed my heart out into the desert, not the trial. That's how our heart affects our worship. It really comes down to what is the center of my attention. It comes down to my beliefs. What is driving my heart? Now would you come back to Psalm 100 again as we look at the second stanza in verses 4 and 5. And again in verse 4 we have instruction to worship. It is really a repeat of the first stanza with some added instruction, some added detail. He says in verse 4, enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name. These are specific acts of worship which please God, which glorify God. People will often say worship is not a performance, but really it is a performance. It's just that we're not the audience, we who happen to be sitting here. All of us are performing for God. God is the audience, and this is our intent, is to honor him, to please him in the words, in the things we say, the things we think about. God is most honored and most pleased when our worship is coming from beliefs that are true, beliefs that have come from him. And that's what's governing our worship. In verse 5, he gives us 3 statements of belief that come directly from God. He said in verse 5, for the Lord is good. That is his nature. That is who he is. He is good by nature. So when you ask God to intervene in a situation, you are asking God, who is already good. There's no question about his goodness. He doesn't have to prove his goodness by doing what you want him to do or not doing what you don't want him to do. He's already good, no matter how he responds. But it would help you, as you come to him and ask him to work, if you would remember that and meditate on that, that no matter how God responds to this prayer, no matter what he does, he is good. His goodness never changes. That's part of his nature. That's how we take a normal human doubt and turn it into a statement of trust that is based on something God has revealed about himself. The second statement he made in verse 5 is his steadfast love endures forever. And again, this describes his nature. He is love. He doesn't just show love, he is love. This is who he is, and it is eternal. It is steadfast. And we see that over and over again throughout, especially the Old Testament, the steadfast love of God. The fact that the love of God never changes. It is eternal. God does not love us any more or less today than he did 5 years ago or 10 years ago. His love for us has never changed and never will change. It is not based on circumstances or anything we do or fail to do. God's love is constant. It is always the same. It never changes. And so everything that God does in our lives is the result of his love for us. Sometimes we don't understand that, or it doesn't make sense to us, but that's when we bring our natural question back to the truth that God has revealed about himself. This is true regardless of how things look right now. God is love. His love is steadfast and it endures forever. It will never change. And then he said third in verse 5, his faithfulness to all generations. God is eternally faithful. God will always keep every single promise that he has made. All of his promises, he is always the same. He never changes. When we come before God and we are listening to ourselves, we naturally tend to focus on our circumstances, our problems, or the people in our lives who have caused problems. That's a natural response when we're listening to ourselves. And that's what needs to change, who we're listening to. When we're struggling in our relationship and in our worship, we need to change who we're listening to. Because listening to ourselves will produce anxiety, depression, discouragement, turning away from God, focusing on what we want from God. But when we are telling ourselves the truth, then we tend to focus more on what God is doing and who God is and how he has kept his promises. So my question for you this morning, how much difference would it make in your life and in your worship if before you worship, before you say anything to God, you were to stop and focus on his greatness? If you were to stop and fill your heart and your mind with reality, with truth that has come from God. God is always good. His love for me is eternal and steadfast. It will never change. And God is absolutely faithful. He is eternally faithful. He will always keep his promises. I think it would make a tremendous difference in our thanksgiving and in our worship. Would you pray with me? Father, today we are thankful for what you've accomplished. We're thankful for the reminders that you've given us, the revelation you've given us in your word that help us to understand who you are. And Lord, I pray that you would help each of us, lead each of us in growth in these things. All of us need growth because this does not come naturally to any of us to think this way about you or to believe these things about you. And yet you have revealed this, and we trust you to plant this firmly in our thinking and in our minds. May it make a difference in the way that we approach you and in the way in which we live our lives. Help us to live our lives as an act of worship before you. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. I forgot to ask how to close the service this morning, so nobody's rushing up here, so I'm going to assume you're dismissed. Thank you for worshiping with us today.